Story 1. The Grain Ledgers of Eleusis. How Ancient Greeks Tracked Wheat Without Falling Asleep. If you were a citizen of Eleusis in the 5th century BCE, you might think the most important events in your city revolved around the grand Eleusinian mysteries, those sacred rites promising a better afterlife to the initiated. And while those ceremonies indeed drew pilgrims and prestige, the quiet backbone of Eleusis was something far less mystical: the meticulous grain ledgers. Grain in the ancient Greek world was not merely food, it was the currency of survival. A bad harvest could mean famine. A surplus could be traded for timber, metals, or even mercenary soldiers. In Eleusis, sitting at the edge of the fertile Thriasian plain, grain was the city's heartbeat, and the ledgers were its pulse monitor. The men tasked with keeping these records, the citiphylax, were neither priests nor politicians. They were more like accountants in sandals, sworn to tally every sack of wheat and barley that passed through the public granaries. The records were kept on wax tablets, their smooth surfaces repeatedly inscribed, scraped clean and inscribed again. Later, for longer storage, the information was transferred to wooden tablets coated with gypsum or inscribed on thin sheets of lead, rolled up, and stored in the archives. The ledgers themselves were organized not by poetic theme or mythical reference, but by the driest of categories: quantity, storage location, owner, and date received. This precision was crucial. Grain shipments came in from local farms, tribute from allied polis, and sometimes as spoils from military campaigns. Each had to be tracked, for the city's assembly might decide to redistribute stores in times of need or sell portions to fund public works. Even the terminology was mind-numbingly specific. Measures were recorded in metamnoi and choinex units that required a precise understanding of volume, especially when disputes arose between seller and buyer. The citiphylax had to calibrate their official measuring vessels regularly, a task about as thrilling as watching amphorae dry. But for the citizens, these ledgers were a lifeline. The grain records determined how much bread might cost at the agora, whether there would be enough seed for the next planting, or if the polis would need to ration supplies. In years of poor harvests, the records became tools of political leverage. A skilled orator could point to the numbers to argue for importing grain from the Black Sea colonies, or less honorably to manipulate fears of scarcity for personal gain. Maintaining the ledgers also meant managing the human element: the dockworkers unloading grain sacks, the guards posted at the granary doors, the scribes tasked with duplicating records for public display. There were endless opportunities for corruption: a few sacks skimmed here, a lost shipment there, and so the citiphylax were required to swear oaths before the gods to uphold honesty. Breaking that oath was not only a civic crime, but a religious offense, inviting divine wrath as well as legal punishment. While the Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a glimpse of life beyond death, the grain ledgers grounded the city firmly in the here and now. Their orderly rows of figures were the invisible scaffolding of civic life, ensuring that festivals could be fed, armies provisioned, and trade sustained. And yet, for all their importance, these ledgers were rarely celebrated. No poet sang of their columns of numbers. No sculptor carved a statue of a citiphylax at work. They existed in the quiet shadows of temples and archives, quietly holding the city together, grain by grain, figure by figure. But here's the question. In a society so steeped in myth and spectacle, why did the truly life-sustaining records, the plain, unadorned ledgers, remain almost entirely invisible in public memory? If Section 1 gave you the quiet hum of the ledger room, Section 2 is where we step outside into the fields, the granaries, and the harbors to see exactly how those ledgers were fed with their lifeblood of grain. Because a ledger is only as accurate as the measurements it records, the citiphylax depended on a chain of laborers, merchants, and inspectors, whose work began long before the grain arrived at the counting tables. The growing season. Eleusis' fertile lands benefited from a Mediterranean climate: wet winters for germination, hot, dry summers for ripening. But there was nothing inevitable about a good harvest. Farmers plowed with wooden ards tipped in bronze, a tool that did little more than scratch the surface. Soil exhaustion was a constant risk, so fields were often left fallow every other year. The ledgers reflected these cycles. In a fallow year, the city would brace for lower yields and perhaps negotiate imports in advance. Wheat, triticum, and barley, hordeum, dominated the entries. Barley was more drought-resistant and thus a safer bet in lean years, though wheat fetched higher prestige at market. The ledgers tracked not just total grain, but the proportion of each type A detail dull enough to make most citizens' eyes glaze over, but crucial for bakers and brewers who needed specific grains for their craft. Measuring and transport. When a farmer brought grain to the city, it didn't go straight into the public stores. First, it was weighed and measured at the city gates by appointed officials. Grain came in woven sacks or in large ceramic pitha, sealed with clay to deter pests and theft. The clay seal often bore a stamp not unlike a modern custom seal showing the farm or merchant's mark. A medimnos was roughly equivalent to 52 liters, but regional variations meant disputes were common. A small discrepancy, even just a choinix or two, about 1 liter, multiplied across hundreds of transactions, could mean a significant gain or loss for the city treasury. That's why the measuring vessels, often bronze or ceramic, were kept in locked storage and inspected for tampering. The grain was then logged into a temporary receipt ledger, noting the owner, quantity, and intended destination, storage, sale, or redistribution. Only after it passed inspection for quality, no mold, no signs of weevil infestation, would it be moved into official granary storage and transferred into the permanent ledger. The granaries. Eleusis had several state-run granaries, large, rectangular structures with thick stone walls and raised wooden floors to keep the grain dry. Ventilation was critical, and the roof design allowed for air circulation without letting in rain. Guards patrolled the entrances, and torches were forbidden inside. A single spark could wipe out the city's reserves. Each granary had its own subledger so that officials could pinpoint exactly where a given shipment was stored. The grain was arranged in neat, labeled rows, sacks stacked for easy counting. The ledger entries for granaries were maddeningly repetitive. 1 medimnos barley, lot 3, north wall, received from Callias of the Thriasian plain. Then the next line, and the next the same format, only the names and quantities changing. Imports and trade. Local harvests rarely met the city's full needs, so Eleusis, like Athens, relied heavily on imports from the Black Sea colonies. Grain ships, wide-bellied merchant vessels called halcades, would dock at the harbor of Piraeus before their cargo was transported overland. Here, the ledgers expanded to include customs fees, shipping dates, and the names of merchants or foreign emissaries. Import records are where politics seeped into the numbers. A spike in Black Sea imports might hint at a poor local harvest, but it could also signal trade deals or diplomatic favors. The citiphylax had to remain neutral, recording quantities without commenting on the political motives behind them. Still, the assembly would read between the lines. Rations and redistribution. Perhaps the most socially significant entries in the ledgers concerned public rations. In times of shortage, the city might allocate grain to citizens at subsidized rates. These entries were long and bureaucratic. Lists of eligible households, quantities allotted, distribution dates, and confirmation marks once the grain was collected. The records were so meticulous that historians today can reconstruct population estimates from them. Every name on the ration list represented not just a mouth to feed, but a thread in the fabric of civic identity. For receiving public grain was a sign of belonging to the polis. Foreigners and slaves rarely appeared in these entries, their needs met through private means. Religious and festival allocations. Even the gods appeared in the ledgers. Festivals like the Eleusinian mysteries required vast quantities of grain for offerings, feasts, and ritual baking. These allocations were carefully noted. 2 medimnoi wheat for Demeter's altar, 1 medimnos barley for sacred loaves. Such entries remind us that even the most solemn rites had logistical underpinnings. Why the ledgers mattered. If you look at these records in isolation, they can seem lifeless, a parade of numbers, names, and storage locations. But collectively, they told the story of the city's survival strategies. They captured the rhythms of sowing and reaping, the risks of weather and war, the ebb and flow of trade. And perhaps most intriguingly, they reveal that Eleusis, famous for guarding the secrets of the afterlife, was equally devoted to guarding the secrets of a stable grain supply. Without the ledgers, the city's population might have faced hunger, unrest, and decline. Yet one question remains. Given their importance, why were the Citiphylax themselves so little celebrated in public life, their names barely remembered, their work absent from monuments and plays? Was it humility or deliberate invisibility? If the first two sections showed us the mechanics of the grain ledgers, the counting, the measuring, the storing, section 3 is where we explore the consequences. What happened when the numbers went wrong, when nature or humans disrupted the tidy columns, and when a city's survival hinged on the accuracy of those quiet records? Because for all their monotony, the grain ledgers of Eleusis had the power to avert disaster or hasten it. When ledgers lie, even the most diligent Citiphylax could be tempted. The grain trade was a rich temptation for anyone with access to the stores, and a false entry in a ledger could hide theft for months. Sometimes it was a matter of personal gain, a scribe quietly shaving a medimnos from every shipment and selling it off in the market. Other times it was political, allies rewarded with inflated allotments, enemies starved through the loss of their rations. Inscriptions from other polis tell of trials where officials were accused of altering grain accounts. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to exile. In a society where famine could spark riots, tampering with the ledgers was as serious as treason. Nature's hand in the numbers. Even honest records could become meaningless when nature intervened. A sudden infestation of grain weevils might turn neat rows of sacks into worthless dust. A damp autumn could rot wheat before it was baked into bread. These disasters were recorded in grim, dry lines. Lot 7, north wall, spoiled, removed and burned. The loss was tallied, but the hungry mouths remained. Such entries often prompted the assembly to authorize emergency imports. But imported grain was expensive, and the ships had to run the gauntlet of Aegean storms and piracy. The ledgers show how swiftly a comfortable surplus could collapse into scarcity, and how closely civic stability was tied to the fickle yields of the land. Ledgers in wartime. Wartime changed everything. Eleusis, so close to Athens, often felt the ripples of Athenian conflicts. During the Peloponnesian War, Attica's farmlands were ravaged by Spartan invasions, and rural populations flooded into the city walls. Suddenly, the ledgers ballooned with new ration lists, hastily written in cramped columns to fit the surge of names. Armies needed grain too, and not just for the soldiers. Horses and pack animals consumed enormous quantities, recorded in special subledgers that detailed oat and barley allocations. These wartime records give us a rare glimpse of military logistics. For every spear and shield, there were sacks of grain quietly keeping the army on its feet. A mirror of social order. The ledgers also acted as an unintentional census. Who received grain from the public stores, whose name appeared year after year. The entries reinforced social hierarchies. Citizens were entitled to certain rations in times of scarcity. Medics, resident foreigners, had to buy their supplies at market rates. Slaves depended entirely on their masters. In this way, the ledgers quietly policed the boundaries of belonging. The act of recording a name was not merely administrative, it was a declaration of who was recognized by the city and who was invisible in its official memory. Religious reverence for records. Strangely, while the ledgers themselves were not celebrated in public art, they were bound up with religious observance. The Citiphylax swore their oaths before Demeter, goddess of grain, and Persephone, whose yearly descent and return mirrored the agricultural cycle. Some scholars think that the secrecy of the Eleusinian mysteries may have influenced how grain accounting was viewed, that the hidden power of these records was meant to be respected, not displayed. Just as the initiates of the mysteries were entrusted with sacred knowledge, the Sidophilics were entrusted with the city's earthly lifeline. When numbers became history, centuries later, long after Eleusis' prominence faded, fragments of these ledgers were discovered scratched into lead sheets, baked into clay, or mentioned in surviving decrees. They are not poetic. They do not sing. They are simply lists, measured in metamnoi and choinics, as patient and unhurried as the seasons they recorded. Yet from these dull lists, historians have reconstructed trade routes, population sizes, farming practices, even the political alliances that shaped the grain supply. The ledgers outlived the men who wrote them, the fields they tracked, and the very city they served. The quiet power of the mundane. In a world that celebrated heroes, philosophers, and gods, the grain ledger was the city's quiet insurance policy. It demanded no applause, sought no glory, yet held the weight of survival in its unadorned lines. And maybe that's why they stayed invisible, because true security often lives in the background, unheralded, until the moment it fails. So here's the thought to take with you. If a civilization's survival could hinge on something as dull as a table of numbers, what invisible ledgers are shaping our own world today quietly, anonymously, and without fanfare? Story 2. Hades' Breakfast Table, the daily diet of the Lord of the Underworld. When you imagine Hades, you probably see the stern ruler of the dead seated on a black throne, a crown of iron upon his head, his gaze fixed somewhere between eternity and judgment. You may picture him feasting on the souls of mortals, a common misconception that has more to do with later horror tales than Greek myth itself. In truth, Hades had no appetite for human souls. They were shades, insubstantial as mist, incapable of sating any hunger. If we step away from the shadowy poetry and into the plain logistics of myth, a more pedestrian question emerges. What did the god of the underworld eat? And here, the answer is both unexpectedly ordinary and quietly revealing about Greek religious thought. Food for a god who never leaves home. Unlike Zeus, who wandered from Olympus to the mortal world, or Hermes, who darted between realms, Hades was largely stationary. His home was fixed, a subterranean palace ringed by the rivers Styx, Acheron, and Lethe. This meant that his provisions had to be either brought down from the surface or cultivated within the underworld itself. Greek poets rarely describe the divine larder in detail, but hints survive. The Homeric hymn to Demeter suggests that Persephone, while living with Hades, ate pomegranate seeds, the very act that bound her to return each year. Pomegranate, with its blood-red juice and hard, protective rind, was sacred to both Demeter and Persephone, and by extension to Hades. It was a fruit of both life and death, its seeds promising rebirth in spring and its color echoing the finality of the grave. This single reference gives us a foothold. Hades' table likely included symbolic foods tied to fertility, death, and the agricultural cycle. Offerings from the living. In Greek religion, gods received offerings through sacrifice. For Hades, these were chthonic offerings, rituals conducted at night, with black animals, often entirely burned or buried, so that the smoke and essence might descend to the underworld. Wine was poured into the earth. Honey, milk, and grains were cast into pits or trenches. The living did not expect Hades to eat these in a literal sense, but the gesture symbolically nourished the god, maintaining favor and balance between realms. The accounts of Pausanias and other ancient writers mention subterranean shrines and altars without fire, where offerings were made directly into the ground. The absence of a living flame was intentional. The gifts were meant for the darkness, not the daylight gods. If Hades partook of mortal goods at all, it would have been through these symbolic channels. Honey, dark bread, pomegranate and roasted meat from sacrificial animals may have been considered his rightful due. The kitchen of the underworld. If we indulge the idea that the underworld had kitchens, and some myths do suggest the presence of domestic spaces, then the ingredients would have been drawn from two sources: imports from the mortal world and the eerie flora of the underworld itself. Classical writers occasionally describe the asphodel meadows, where the majority of the dead wandered. Asphodel, a hardy perennial with pale flowers, was associated with funerary rites in the afterlife. While not especially tasty, it was edible in its bulb form, and some scholars suggest it may have been part of the mythical underworld diet. Theophrastus, in his botanical writings, notes that the asphodel's tuber could be boiled or roasted, though it was considered food for the poor. Other plants associated with death, such as cypress and poppy, may have grown in the underworld's imagined gardens. Poppy seeds, in particular, were linked to Demeter and Persephone, symbolizing both sleep and death. Mixed with honey, they could form a dense, nourishing paste. A question of appetite. But here, where myth and practicality diverge, the gods did not require sustenance in the mortal sense. Their food was ambrosia, their drink nectar, both divine substances with no perfect mortal equivalent. The poets describe ambrosia as sometimes arriving in golden bowls, sometimes carried by doves or other messengers from Olympus. If Hades consumed ambrosia, it would have been brought to him a perpetual reminder that, despite his separation from Olympus, he was still one of the Olympian 12 in status, if not in geography. Still, Greek art and poetry often tailored divine banquets to human imagination, so the foods associated with Hades may have been shaped as much by symbolic meaning as by any consistent tradition. The politics of the table. If Persephone's presence half the year brought a livelier spread to the underworld, that too would have been noted in story rather than practice. In Athenian agricultural festivals, particularly the Thesmophoria, women offered cakes and other foods linked to Persephone's myth, reinforcing the idea that the seasonal reunion of the god and goddess was tied to the fertility of the land. Hades' diet, then, wasn't about taste, but about maintaining the cosmic order. The food on his table reflected the pact between life and death, between the surface and the shadows. So here we arrive at a strangely quiet truth. The god most feared for his domain may have dined on the same fruits, grains, and honey that any mortal might have eaten, only seasoned with the weight of eternal symbolism. And that leaves us with a lingering curiosity. If the ruler of the dead shared the same foods as the living, where exactly was the boundary between their worlds drawn at the palate, or somewhere far deeper? In Section 1, we explored the symbolic and ritual associations of Hades: diet pomegranate seeds, honey, grains, and offerings lowered into the earth. Now we'll look closer at the mechanics of how such food might have reached him, the role of mythic messengers, and the way the Greeks imagined his table in contrast to those of other gods. Because if there's one thing Greek religion was consistent about, it was inconsistency. Stories shifted, images varied, and yet certain details, however dull, persisted like the background hum of a lyre string. The logistics of a god who never travels. A god who lives in the underworld does not stroll to the Agra for figs. Hades depended on intermediaries. The most likely candidates were Hermes in his role as Psychopompos, guide of souls, and Charon, the ferryman. Hermes is sometimes depicted in vase paintings carrying not just his caduceus but satchels or vessels, suggesting he could bear goods between worlds. But there's another class of messenger, the Therapont's divine attendants. Though not often named in relation to Hades, other gods had such aides, and it's reasonable to suppose the underworld palace had its own stewards and servants drawn from among the shades or underworld spirits. They may have fetched offerings from the surface altars, translated them into ambrosia, or presented them in ceremonial fashion. Ambrosia in the shadows. Ambrosia was the one unifying element in the divine diet. The Iliad and Odyssey make clear that while mortals ate bread and meat, the gods ate ambrosia and drank nectar, substances that did not decay and which granted immortality. But if ambrosia came from Olympus, then it had to cross the most secure border in the cosmos to reach Hades. Did Zeus send it by dove? Did Hermes carry it tucked under his cloak? No ancient source specifies, yet the implication is clear. Even the ruler of the dead had his place at the broader Olympian table, whether in person or by proxy. This raises a subtle theological point. Hades was feared and respected, but he was not other in the way mortals imagined. His nourishment, like his authority, was of the same divine order as his siblings. The role of Persephone. Half the year, Persephone shared Hades' table. This seasonal cohabitation brought the underworld into closer contact with the fertility cycle of the living world. Some scholars argue that the foods Persephone brought with her seeds, fruits, and prepared cakes from the festivals held in her honor symbolically replenished the underworld pantry. The Thesmophoria festival, celebrated by women in Athens and other cities, involved depositing offerings in subterranean pits, later retrieved in a ritual act that mirrored Persephone's descent and return. These offerings sometimes included piglets, pine boughs, and grain, all meant to ensure agricultural fertility. The connection between these surface rituals and the imagined diet of Hades is speculative, but it's a link ancient worshippers would have understood instinctively. What goes down must, in some form, come back up. Underworld agriculture. If we imagine the underworld as a mirror of the living world, a concept common in Greek thought, then it would have its own fields, orchards, and gardens. The difference lay in the quality of the crops: pale, unearthly, resistant to decay, but perhaps lacking the vivid flavor of mortal produce. The asphodel meadows mentioned by Homer may have been the underworld's breadbasket, not because the dead ate there, but because asphodel was hardy and symbolic. The plant's bulb, boiled or roasted, might have been the staple for any imagined underworld feasts. And then there's the poppy, sacred to both Demeter and Persephone. Poppies grow easily in poor soil, and in the underworld they would have been abundant. Their seeds, when mixed with honey, form a paste both sustaining and soporific, a fitting food for a realm of eternal rest. Contrast with other gods' tables. On Olympus, feasts were occasions for boasting, scheming, and cementing alliances. The poets fill these scenes with roasted meats, flowing nectar, and the laughter of the gods. Hades' imagined banquets were more restrained, more private, more ceremonial. In vase paintings, when Hades is shown dining, the focus is rarely on the food. Instead, the emphasis is on the setting, the throne, the crown, the presence of Persephone, as if the act of dining was less about the meal and more about affirming the stability of the underworld. Food as diplomacy. Offerings to Hades also served as diplomatic gestures between mortals and gods. When cities faced plague, famine, or political unrest, special sacrifices might be made directly to the underworld deities. These were not celebratory feasts, but acts of appeasement, meals sent to the depths in hopes of securing protection or mercy. Such offerings could be meticulously recorded in temple accounts. The number of animals sacrificed, the type of grain used, the amount of wine poured. Dry as they seem, these entries reveal how deeply embedded Hades' diet was in the administrative life of the polis. The persistence of symbolism. Even in later periods, when Greek religion blended with Roman practices, the foods linked to Hades remained largely the same: pomegranates, grains, honey, and dark-hued sacrificial animals. These were not just tokens. They were part of a centuries-old symbolic language that expressed the boundaries between life and death. So, while Hades might never have lifted a spoon to mortal lips, his table, imagined, ritualized, and symbolized, was one of the most carefully tended in all of Greek religion. But that leads to one final puzzle. If the god's diet was so bound up in ritual and symbol, did anyone in the ancient world truly believe Hades ate at all, or was his breakfast nothing more than an eternal metaphor? If the first two sections gave us the ingredients and logistics of Hades' imagined meals, this final section asks what those meals meant not just to the god himself, but to the people who feared, respected, and fed him through ritual. Because in ancient Greek thought, food wasn't simply sustenance. It was a language, a binding contract between mortals and the divine. The function of the meal in myth. In Homeric and Hesiodic tradition, meals mark important moments. Alliances are forged over banquets, heroes are honored with feasts, and even disputes are settled at the table. For Hades, however, the meal was less about camaraderie and more about cosmic order. The most famous example is Persephone's pomegranate seeds. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the act of eating binds her to the underworld for part of each year. This meal is a contract, a symbolic marriage, a seasonal guarantee that death and life will share custody of the earth's fertility. Thus, when worshippers imagined Hades' table, they were not picturing a casual breakfast. They were picturing a throne room dining space where every dish reinforced the permanence of the order he upheld. The underworld banquet as theater. Greek vase paintings and reliefs sometimes depict Hades and Persephone seated together, holding cups or fruits with attendants nearby. These images are curiously still, no raucous laughter, no movement. The underworld banquet was a tableau, a symbolic performance, rather than a scene of indulgence. The table might bear pomegranates, loaves of dark bread, bowls of honey, and perhaps a roasted animal, the same gifts offered in chthonic rites. In this way, the imagined meal served as a mirror of mortal offerings, reassuring the living that their gifts were received and acknowledged. Offerings as sustenance or currency. To the Greeks, the gods did not consume food for nutrition. They consumed the honor and devotion embodied in the offering. A burnt sacrifice pleased the god not because of its flavor, but because of the gesture, the mortal willingly relinquishing something valuable. For Hades, offerings were also a form of toll. Just as Charon demanded his coin for ferrying souls, Hades received his due from the living to ensure safe passage, good harvests, or relief from plague. The food on his table could thus be read as the physical manifestation of debts paid to the ruler of the dead. Seasonal rhythm of the table. If Persephone's descent marked the start of the underworld's full season, her return heralded a leaner table. In mythic terms, this mirrored the agricultural calendar. Winter and early spring, when she dwelt below, were times of scarcity on the surface. Her re-emergence in late spring marked the time of abundance. One could imagine Hades' breakfasts if he took them varying with this rhythm. During Persephone's absence, the table might hold the austere staples of the realm: asphodel bulbs, honeyed poppy paste, and preserved grains. During her stay, the table could be brightened with fresh pomegranates, figs, and the symbolic first fruits from the living world's harvest. The absence of flesh. Curiously, while surface gods were often depicted feasting on roasted meat from sacrifices, Hades is rarely associated with the act of eating flesh. This may be because meat, especially from burnt offerings, belonged symbolically to the gods above, who received the savory smoke. The offerings to Hades were often whole burnt or buried, bypassing the communal feasts that followed sacrifices to other gods. This absence further underlines the solemnity of his meals. If his table bore meat at all, it was as a sign of the complete surrender of the animal to his domain. What it meant to the worshippers. To those who performed chthonic rites, imagining Hades at his table was not an act of curiosity, it was a necessity. The food they offered had to arrive in some form. Otherwise, the act lost its meaning. The visual of Hades and Persephone receiving their due was part of the reassurance that the balance between life and death remained intact. This was especially important in times of uncertainty. during plagues when the line between the living and the dead blurred, during wars when bodies lay unburied, during famine when the harvest failed. In each case, ensuring Hades' symbolic table was full was a way to stabilize the unseen order. From ritual to metaphor. Over time, as Greek religion blended with philosophy, the literal image of Hades eating gave way to a metaphorical understanding. The underworld fed on the dead, just as the living fed on the earth's bounty. This wasn't a matter of appetite, but of cycles, the endless exchange between life and death, seed and soil, offering and blessing. In this light, Hades' breakfast becomes less a menu and more a statement of cosmic law. Everything that lives must one day pass to his keeping, and in return, life above continues. The quiet continuity. Unlike the dramatic myths of Zeus, thunderbolts, or Athena's battles, the imagery of Hades' table remained remarkably consistent for centuries. Pomegranate, honey, grain, and dark libations, these staples persisted from the archaic period into Roman times, and even into later folklore. They required no innovation, no reinvention. They simply continued, as steady and inevitable as Hades himself. So here, where we end this sleepy inquiry, if Hades truly sat to breakfast each morning, it was not in hunger, but in ritual, a meal set to remind gods and mortals alike that the boundaries between their worlds are not meant to be broken, only crossed in due time. And perhaps the real question is this: when the living set a table for the dead, are they feeding the god, or feeding their own need for order in a world where nothing is permanent? Story 3. The olive oil tax records of Athens. Why drips mattered more than battles. If you were an Athenian in the 5th century BCE, you might think your city's fate depended on the outcome of naval battles or the oratory of the assembly. But beneath the speeches and the sales, there was another, quieter ledger that shaped Athenian power: the records of olive oil taxes. Athens was ringed by olive groves, some planted centuries before the Persian Wars, their gnarled trunks twisting out of dry soil like living archives. Olives were more than food, they were an economic engine. The oil pressed from them lit lamps, anointed athletes, preserved food, and even served as a base for perfumes and medicinal ointments. To control olive oil was to control a vital artery of civic life. The legal roots of the olive oil monopoly. The Athenians didn't leave olive oil production to chance. Athenian law, preserved in later inscriptions, prohibited the cutting down of certain sacred olive trees known as moriae. These were believed to be descendants of the original tree gifted by Athena herself in her contest with Poseidon for the patronage of the city. The state claimed ownership over these trees, and damaging them could lead to exile or death. From these sacred groves came part of the oil that filled the state's coffers. Private producers could cultivate their own trees, but all significant trade was taxed. The records of these taxes kept in the archives on the Acropolis were as dry and methodical as any merchant's logbook. Each entry listed the producer's name, the amount of oil, the point of export, and the tax paid, usually in drachmae or fractions thereof. Measuring the drips. Athenians measured oil in chos and meter-tie liquid measures that had to be precisely calibrated. A shortfall in volume, even by a few drops, could trigger disputes. Inspectors called metronome oversaw the measuring process, using bronze vessels with standardized capacity. Any fraud watering down oil, falsifying quantity, could be punished with fines or confiscation. Because oil was dense and valuable, merchants transported it in large ceramic amphorae sealed with stamped clay lids. The stamp served as a guarantee of both origin and authenticity. For exports, particularly to colonies and allies, the Athenian owl often appeared on the stamp, a symbol of civic pride and in some ways brand recognition. Why oil was worth taxing. Oil was not just a domestic staple, it was one of Athens' most profitable exports. The city shipped olive oil throughout the Aegean and into the wider Mediterranean. Some amphorae have been found as far afield as Egypt and the Black Sea coast, their inscriptions still faintly legible after millennia. Taxation served multiple purposes. It generated revenue for the state, regulated quality, and ensured that sacred groves maintained their privileged status. A portion of tax revenue went directly to funding public works, temples, roads, even parts of the city's navy. In this way, the lighting of an Athenian lamp was indirectly connected to the launching of an Athenian trireme. Oil and civic ritual. Olive oil wasn't just an export commodity, it was deeply woven into Athenian ritual life. Victors in the Panathenaic Games received amphorae filled with sacred olive oil, their ceramic surfaces painted with images of Athena. The amount could be staggering, hundreds of liters for a single champion. Such prizes were both an honor and a form of wealth. The tax ledgers recorded these distributions separately, noting them as religious or ceremonial exemptions from standard trade duties. This distinction was important. The oil given as a prize was considered part of the sacred economy, untouchable by ordinary taxation. The unseen bureaucracy. To keep this system running, Athens maintained a network of scribes, inspectors, and warehouse supervisors. Oil was stored in cool, dark cellars beneath public buildings, where amphorae were stacked in neat rows. Periodic inspections ensured that the oil hadn't spoiled, leaked, or been tampered with. The ledgers tracked these inventories with numbing precision. From the grove of Ligros, 40-meter tie, sealed. From the grove of Lysimachos, 15-meter tie, inspected and approved. Over time, these records formed a map of the city's economic heartbeat, where the oil came from, how it moved, and how much the city profited. The politics of drips. Like grain ledgers, oil tax records could be leveraged in political debates. An ambitious politician might call for lowering export duties to win favor with merchants, while another might argue for raising them to fund a new public building. The assembly often consulted the ledgers before making such decisions, using the numbers to bolster rhetorical claims. So while the histories of Athens often tell us about the clash of fleets and the speeches of great men, the truth is that the city's wealth and its ability to act on the world stage flowed in part from the slow, steady accounting of olive oil, recorded drop by drop. But that raises a quiet question. In a city so fiercely proud of its democracy, did the ordinary citizen ever realize just how much their daily lamplighting was tied to the taxes hidden in these amphorae? In Section 1, we saw how Athens' olive oil taxes were rooted in sacred law, standardized measurement, and export economics. Now we step deeper into the machinery of this quiet powerhouse, following the oil from tree to tax ledger, and tracing how a few scribbled figures on a wax tablet could ripple outward into politics, infrastructure, and even international relations. From grove to press. The olive harvest in Attica was a slow, careful affair. Unlike grain, which was reaped in a rush before the stalks dried out, olives could be picked over weeks, sometimes months, as they ripened at different rates. Farmers often spread cloth beneath the trees, gently knocking olives loose with sticks. Too much force could bruise the fruit, lowering the quality of the oil and consequently its taxable value. The pressing process itself varied. Small producers used hand-operated stone mortars, but larger estates and sacred groves employed lever or screw presses to extract more oil. The juice was collected in clay basins, where the golden liquid separated from the darker vegetal water beneath. Skilled workers skimmed off the oil for storage, leaving the bitter residue behind. These first stages already had tax implications. Inspectors could be present during pressing to estimate yields, ensuring no oil went unrecorded. If a producer claimed a poor harvest, but the presses told another story, a dispute could arise long before the amphorae reached the docks. Warehousing and quality control. Once pressed, the oil was poured into amphorae and sealed with stamped clay lids. These amphorae were then stored in warehouses, some privately owned, others controlled by the state before being sold locally or shipped abroad. The tax ledgers broke down these inventories in methodical, almost hypnotic repetition. 2 meter tie from the grove of Askans, stored in warehouse B, row 14, amphory sealed and marked with owl stamp. 5 meter tie from the sacred grove of Athena Skiras, stored in warehouse C, row 3, amphory sealed with state mark. Spoilage was a serious concern. Olive oil could turn rancid if exposed to heat, air, or light. Warehouse supervisors were responsible for rotating stock and checking seals, and any spoiled oil was recorded as a loss in the ledgers. Even here, the numbers mattered. Too many spoiled amphory, and the Treasury would see a sharp dip in revenue. The flow of taxes. Taxes on olive oil exports were typically collected at the point of departure, either at the port of Piraeus or at smaller coastal outlets. Merchants presented their amphory to customs officials, who checked the stamps, verified quantities, and recorded the taxable amount. Payment could be made in coin, but occasionally in kind, with the state taking a portion of the oil itself for public use. These transactions filled page after page of the state's wax tablets. Once the temporary notes were compiled, they were transferred to permanent records, sometimes on stone inscriptions if they were of public interest. This dual system, temporary and permanent, allowed Athens to monitor trends over time, comparing one season's output to the next. Oil for diplomacy. Athens also used olive oil as a diplomatic tool. Certain allied cities received shipments at reduced or no tax as a gesture of goodwill or in recognition of military support. These exemptions were carefully noted in the ledgers, lest the Treasury forget which shipments were gifts and which were taxable. One particularly telling inscription from the late 5th century BCE records a shipment of 50 amphorae of oil to the people of Samos, untaxed, by decree of the assembly. That same decree appears in both the civic record and the tax register, a reminder that even acts of generosity were subject to bureaucratic confirmation. The political theater of numbers. Because the ledgers contained such detailed economic data, they could be and often were weaponized in political debates. A rising statesman might point to increased oil revenue as proof of his good governance, while an opponent might highlight spoilage rates or falling export numbers to argue mismanagement. The assembly occasionally ordered public readings of these figures, turning dry taxation records into rhetorical ammunition. While few citizens might have grasped the finer points of meter-tie to drachmy conversions, they understood trends. More oil meant prosperity, less meant trouble. The invisible connection to daily life. What's easy to miss in all this bureaucracy is how intimately the oil tax system touched ordinary Athenians. The same oil that paid for triremes and temples also lit humble clay lamps, oiled wrestlers, bodies at the gymnasium, and flavored stews in private homes. A rise in export taxes could raise the price of lamp oil in the agora, meaning that a decision made in the assembly could be felt in the smoky glow of a poor family's evening meal. The global reach of a local crop. Athenian olive oil traveled far. Amphorae with distinctive Athenian stamps have been found in Cyrenaica, Sicily, and the Crimean Peninsula. Each carried not only oil but a piece of Athenian identity: the owl emblem, the precise measurements, the assurance of quality. The tax records show just how deliberate this export strategy was. Routes were mapped, quantities tallied, and profitable markets prioritized. So while we think of Athens, empire in terms of ships, tribute, and military power, much of that power was lubricated literally by olive oil, measured and taxed to the last drop. But this leaves us with an intriguing thought. If oil revenue was so central to Athenian strength, what happened in years when the harvest failed and those precious drips slowed to a trickle? In the previous sections, we saw how olive oil taxes in Athens were calculated, stored, and weaponized in politics. Now we turn to the other side of the ledger, the moments when the system failed, the ripple effects of shortages, and the long afterlife of these records. When the harvest failed, Athens' olive groves were hardy but not invincible. Extended droughts could reduce yields, cold snaps could damage flowering, disease could wipe out entire sections of orchard. The ancient agronomist Theophrastus notes cases where frost destroyed a season's blossoms, leading to an almost complete loss of fruit. In such years, the oil tax records shifted dramatically. Pages that once brimmed with tallies now carried meager numbers. The Treasury faced shortfalls, forcing the Assembly to make difficult decisions. Should they raise other taxes, cut spending on public works, or import oil from abroad? Imports, while a temporary fix, undermined Athens' carefully curated monopoly. Foreign oil lacked the sacred and symbolic status of Athenian oil, and merchants were quick to exploit price differences. Fraud and smuggling. Scarcity also bred corruption. Smugglers might disguise foreign oil in Athenian-stamped amphorae, slipping it through ports without paying proper duties. Others bribed inspectors to underreport quantities, pocketing the difference. The law courts occasionally heard such cases, and trial records show just how contentious they could be. In one surviving fragment of an Athenian speech, a prosecutor accuses a merchant of selling darkness in the place of light, a poetic way of saying he passed off inferior oil as genuine. The case, while framed in moral outrage, was really about lost tax revenue. The oil tax in war. During the Peloponnesian War, oil taxes became both more critical and more volatile. On one hand, the navy needed funding. On the other, Spartan invasions into Attica damaged groves and disrupted harvests. The ledgers from wartime years, where they survive, often show irregular patterns. Sudden spikes when a large shipment could be exported safely, followed by lulls when conflict closed trade routes. War also made Athens more reliant on allied tribute, shifting the economic balance away from oil for a time but never eliminating it entirely. Even in war, lamp oil for households, oil for religious rites, and oil for athletic competitions had to be supplied. The sacred and the secular. One of the most striking features of the olive oil tax system is how it straddled sacred and secular domains. The Morii sacred olive trees provided oil for religious festivals, diplomatic gifts, and Panathenaic prizes. This oil was exempt from standard taxation, but still carefully recorded in separate, sacred ledgers. The coexistence of these two systems, one for the gods, one for the state, reflects the deep entanglement of religion and bureaucracy in Athenian life. Even a simple amphora of oil could be both a commercial product and a sacred object, depending on its origin and destination. Archaeology and afterlife of the records. Today, much of what we know about Athenian olive oil taxation comes from inscribed stone stelae and stamped amphorae found far from Athens. These physical remnants give us snapshots of the broader system: a tax exemption for a friendly city here, a shipment to a colony there. In some cases, archaeologists have pieced together amphora stamps with surviving tax decrees, matching a specific shipment to its recorded entry. It's tedious work, the sort of historical detective work that mirrors the original scribe's patience. Why the drips mattered. To a casual observer, these records are dull. They don't tell of battles won or lost, they don't quote great orators, they don't describe feats of heroism. But without them, Athens' fleet might have gone unfunded, its temples unfinished, its games unprized. The drips in the amphorae were the drips in the treasury, and the treasury was the lifeblood of the city's ambitions. A lesson in invisible power. Olive oil tax records show us that the power of a city can rest on something as small as a drop of liquid, provided that drop is counted, taxed, and put to use. They remind us that great political and military movements are often sustained by quiet, repetitive acts of administration. Sealing amphorae, checking measures, writing entries by lamplight. So the next time you picture Athens in its golden age, its philosophers debating, its triremes patrolling the seas, remember that somewhere in the shadow of the Acropolis, a scribe was scratching into wax. From the grove of Thegenes, 12-meter tie, export to Chios, tax received in full. And perhaps the final question is this. In our own time, what humble records, unnoticed and unglamorous, are quietly underwriting the ambitions we think are built on grander things? Story 4. The Ceramic Jar Inventory of Knossos, palatial bookkeeping at its finest. If you were to walk into the palace complex of Knossos around 1450 BCE, you might expect to be dazzled by painted frescoes, winding corridors, and the imposing throne room. And while those are indeed remarkable, you'd also find something far more numerous and, to the Minoans, just as vital. Rows upon rows of massive ceramic jars, pithae, each carefully placed, labeled, and recorded. These jars were the beating heart of the palace economy. Standing as tall as a man, with broad bellies and thick clay walls, they stored everything from olive oil to grain, from wine to honey. Their sheer number is staggering. Hundreds have been excavated, and the remains suggest there were once many more. To the modern visitor, they might look like decorative artifacts. To the palace administrators, they were a logistical challenge, a network of inventory records that had to be kept precise, season after season, to ensure the palace could function as both a political center and a redistribution hub. The palatial economy. The Palace of Knossos wasn't simply a royal residence. It was an administrative and economic center for the surrounding region. Farmers and craftsmen brought goods as taxes or tribute, which were then stored, processed, and redistributed. The pithae were the palace's vaults, holding not coins but commodities. This system required an organized bureaucracy. Minoan scribes recorded inventory on clay tablets using Linear B script, and earlier, the still undeciphered Linear A. These records detailed the jar's contents, quantity, and location within the labyrinthine storage halls. Measuring storage. The pithae varied in capacity. Some held a few dozen liters, others several hundred. Measuring their contents was no small task. The administrators likely used calibrated measuring vessels, pouring in goods until the jar reached its capacity mark. Once full, a jar was sealed with clay or plaster to keep out pests and moisture. The seal might be stamped with the emblem of the palace or the mark of the official responsible for its contents. A typical record might read something like: Hall 3, Jar 17, oil, 250 liters from the village of Amnizos, sealed by the hand of scribe's name. These notes, dry as they seem, allowed the palace to track goods not just for consumption, but for trade, ensuring that the same jar promised to a trading partner wasn't accidentally given to another. Contents beyond oil. While olive oil was a staple, the inventories also included grain, wine, figs, honey, and pulses. Each had its own storage requirements. Honey, for example, could ferment if exposed to too much heat. Wine required secure seals to prevent spoilage. In some cases, pithae contained mixtures, oil infused with herbs for medicinal or ceremonial purposes. Animal products, too, might be preserved in jars, salted fish, or rendered fats. The variety meant that palace scribes had to be fluent not only in writing, but in the practicalities of storage, shelf life, and seasonal demand. The layout of storage rooms. The storage wings of Knossos were deliberately organized. Large, heavy pithae were kept near the main corridors for ease of loading and unloading. Smaller or more fragile containers were placed deeper inside, sometimes on raised platforms to avoid damp floors. Ventilation was key. Narrow shafts allowed air to circulate while keeping the rooms cool and dark. Light was scarce, so workers likely moved by torch or lamp, careful to avoid knocking over valuable jars. A system of accountability. Every jar was more than a container. It was a responsibility. Palace officials were accountable for the goods under their care, and any shortfall could lead to penalties. Regular inspections ensured that contents matched the records, and seals were checked for tampering. In this way, the inventory of Pithi was both a record of abundance and a measure of trustworthiness. The act of recording wasn't just clerical, it was a safeguard against theft, spoilage, and mismanagement. Why the inventory mattered. In the absence of coinage, stored goods were currency. Olive oil could be traded for copper from Cyprus. Grain could be sent to islands that had suffered poor harvests. Wine might be given as a diplomatic gift to cement alliances. The Pithi inventories allowed the palace to marshal its resources strategically, ensuring the survival and prosperity of the Minoan network. So while myths later cast Knossos as the home of the Minotaur and a king with a labyrinth, the real labyrinth was perhaps the storage halls, a maze of jars and records, where the fate of the palace rested on the accuracy of a scribe's clay tablet. But here's the question. In a world without money as we know it, did the Minoans realize their most important wealth lay not in the grandeur of the throne room, but in the quiet, sealed darkness of their storerooms? In Section 1, we walk through the palace's storerooms, noting the sheer volume of Pithi and the administrative effort that went into keeping them organized. Now we'll follow the jars through their life cycle from arrival and registration to eventual emptying or redistribution, and see how this boring process was in fact the heartbeat of the Minoan economy. Arrival at the palace. Goods arrived at Knossos from villages, farms, and coastal settlements throughout Crete. Some came as a form of tax or tribute. Others were part of reciprocal trade agreements within the Minoan network. Transporting these goods to the palace was no small task. Olive oil, wine, and other liquids traveled in amphorae or smaller jars, which were then transferred into the massive Pithi for long-term storage. Grain and dried goods came in sacks or baskets, carried by pack animals or carts. Upon arrival, scribes noted the supplier, the type of goods, and their measured volume. The delivery would be inspected for quality. Spoiled grain or sour wine would be rejected or redirected for non-essential uses, such as feeding animals. Recording and placement. Once inspected, goods were assigned to a storage hall and a specific pithos. Placement was strategic. Heavier jars containing staple goods for redistribution were kept close to main corridors and loading points. Specialty goods like perfumed oil or ceremonial wine were stored deeper within the complex, often under tighter security. Linear B records suggest a form of location coding, perhaps similar to modern warehouse shelf labels, to identify exactly where a jar was placed. This allowed administrators to quickly locate goods when fulfilling a trade agreement or preparing for a festival. The seasonal rhythm of storage. The palace inventory changed with the seasons. After the olive harvest, the oil jars would be filled to capacity. After the grain harvest, granaries and jars would swell with barley and wheat. As the year progressed, these stores would slowly diminish, their contents sent out to meet obligations both domestic and foreign. The cyclical nature of this process meant that scribes were constantly updating records, not just adding entries when goods came in, but subtracting amounts as jars were tapped for distribution. A jar might be listed in 3 or 4 different tablets over its lifespan, each marking a change in volume or contents. Distribution and redistribution. One of the palace's primary roles was redistribution. Goods stored in pith could be sent to other Minoan centers, exchanged for raw materials like tin and copper, or given to dependent communities after poor harvests. Religious festivals also drew heavily on palace stores. Honey for offerings, oil for lamps and anointing, grain for bread, these were all drawn from the inventory. Some records distinguish between goods for the gods and those for human consumption, underscoring the dual role of the palace as both a secular and sacred authority. Security and accountability. Given the value of the stored goods, security was essential. The thick clay seals on pithy weren't just to preserve freshness, they were also a safeguard against theft. Breaking a seal without authorization was a serious offense, likely punished by loss of position or worse. Inventory checks involved not only counting jars but verifying seal integrity. If a seal was found broken, scribes would cross-check the current contents against the last recorded measurement to see if any loss had occurred. Trade in the pithos as passport. Large jars from Knossos have been found in archaeological sites across the Aegean, some still bearing palace marks. These marks acted like a brand A guarantee of origin and quality. For trading partners, a jar stamped with a Gnossian seal was as good as a signed contract. The inventories allowed palace administrators to track which jars were sent where, ensuring that diplomatic gifts didn't accidentally go to the wrong recipient. In this way, a humble clay vessel became an instrument of foreign policy. Bureaucracy in clay. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay tablets were durable. When the palace at Knossos suffered fires and collapses, many of the inventory records were baked hard by the heat, preserving them for thousands of years. These accidental archives are why we can reconstruct so much of the palace's storage system today. The records are admittedly repetitive. Pithos in Hall 5, wine 300 liters. Pithos in Hall 8, barley 250 liters. But it's this monotony that reveals the scale and precision of the Minoan bureaucracy. Without these updates, the system would have collapsed under its own complexity. So while the painted halls and mythic associations of Knossos draw the most attention, it was the unending task of measuring, sealing, and recording the palace's jars that kept the whole apparatus running. But it leaves us wondering, in a society where so much wealth was stored in clay and sealed with marks of authority, what happened when a disaster struck and the seals no longer meant anything at all? We've walked through the storerooms of Knossos, traced the life of a pithos from delivery to redistribution, and seen how the palace's administrators maintained a constant cycle of record-keeping. Now, in this final section, we look at what happened when the system failed, and what the survival of these records tells us about the priorities of a civilization that left almost no narrative history behind. Disaster in the storerooms. For all its order, the Gnossian storage system was vulnerable. Earthquakes frequent in Crete could topple Pithae, spilling hundreds of liters of oil or grain in minutes. Archaeologists have found storerooms where jars lie in shattered heaps, the floor still darkened by ancient oil stains. Fires were even more catastrophic. The clay jars themselves could survive, but their contents would be ruined, and the heat could bake the palace's clay tablets into permanence, a mixed blessing for historians. To the scribes of Knossos, this was a total loss. To us, it's an accidental archive. The collapse of authority. The Pithy inventory system depended on centralized control. Each jar was tied, by its seal and its entry in the ledger, to the authority of the palace. When that authority collapsed, whether through internal strife, foreign invasion, or gradual decentralization, the value of those seals disappeared overnight. Without a functioning administration, a sealed pithos was just a heavy jar full of whatever someone could carry away. In the archaeological record, we see evidence of storerooms looted, jars smashed, contents removed, seals broken without regard for protocol. What the records reveal. Because the Minoans didn't leave us extensive written histories, the inventory tablets are among our best sources for understanding their economy. They tell us, scale hundreds of jars stored at once, indicating a centralized and complex supply chain. Diversity, a wide range of goods, from staples to luxury items, each handled with specialized care. Reach stamped jars found abroad confirm that Knossos was part of a larger trade network. Hierarchy, the existence of seals and named officials, suggests a stratified bureaucracy with clear lines of responsibility. These insights all come from what were, in their day, the most boring of documents: repetitive commodity lists, location codes, and sealed descriptions. Religion and the Pythos. While the storerooms were practical, they were not entirely secular. Some jars contained goods reserved for religious use: oil for temple lamps, grain for offerings, honey for ceremonial cakes. These were recorded separately, sometimes with notations indicating a deity or festival. The Pythos, then, was not just a storage vessel, but a bridge between the economic and spiritual life of Knossos. Filling one could be an act of tribute to the palace, the gods, or both. Why it mattered. In a society without coinage, stored goods were not just wealth, they were survival. A bad harvest could be offset by a full storeroom. A diplomatic alliance could be sealed with a shipment of wine or oil. The jar inventories were a map of the palace's power, a silent record of its ability to provide, protect, and project influence. It's easy to imagine the day-to-day work of the scribes. In dim torchlight, stylus in hand, pressing lines into damp clay, one Pythos entry after another. Not glamorous, but essential. Without them, the palace's sprawling economy would dissolve into confusion. The slow fade. The final years of Knossos saw a decline in the scale of the inventory system. Fewer jars were recorded, and some storerooms went unused. Whether this was due to shifting trade patterns, resource depletion, or political instability, the result was the same. The great halls of storage grew quieter, their Pythae standing like silent sentinels over a dwindling economy. When the palace finally fell, the remaining jars became relics too heavy to move easily, too valuable to leave untouched. The seals were broken, the contents consumed, and the careful records of decades were rendered irrelevant. A reflection on clay and memory. And yet, thousands of years later, those same clay records give us a clearer picture of Minoan life than any legend of Minos or the Minotaur. They show us what the palace valued, how it organized itself, and how it fed both its people and its ambitions. The jars themselves, some still upright in their original positions, are the physical echo of a civilization's rhythm, a rhythm marked not by war drums or royal decrees, but by the steady work of measuring, sealing, and counting. So perhaps the real legacy of Knossos is not its myths, but its inventories. The question they leave us with is simple. In our own age, which records tedious, routine, and unremarkable, will one day be the key to understanding how we lived? Story 5. Poseidon's Harbor Fees, accounting for ancient ships or by. In most Greek myths, Poseidon is a god of tempests, earthquakes, and rivalries with his brother Zeus. But for seafaring cities, Poseidon's power was not only measured in storms, it was counted in drachmae. Every ship that entered a harbor under his protection owed a fee, and for centuries this unglamorous but reliable income formed the backbone of many coastal economies. Harbor fees were part religious tribute, part bureaucratic necessity. They were paid to ensure safe passage, to maintain harbor facilities, and at least in theory to fund the upkeep of temples and altars to Poseidon. And while these payments were offered in honor of a god, they were meticulously recorded by very human clerks. The concept of harbor dues. The idea was simple. A ship arriving at a harbor paid for the right to dock, unload goods, and perhaps take on supplies. The fee varied according to the size of the ship, the nature of its cargo, and the length of its intended stay. In some places, particularly those under strong temple authority, the fee was collected at a shrine or altar before unloading could begin. These dues were known by various terms, but in many Aegean ports, they were simply called telos, a payment due. The records combined religious and civic oversight. Priests might accept the offering on behalf of Poseidon, while civic scribes tallied the amount for the local treasury. The role of Poseidon's temples. Temples dedicated to Poseidon were often located near key harbors, acting both as religious centers and as administrative hubs. The Temple of Poseidon at Saunian, for example, may have overseen or at least symbolized the maritime activities of the surrounding coast. In such cases, part of the harbor fee was earmarked for temple upkeep, repairs to columns, maintenance of altars, and the salaries of priests. Records from some sanctuaries list expenditures funded by these fees: payment for new oars for temple-owned vessels, wages for harbor watchmen, and even the purchase of sacrificial animals for annual festivals honoring the god. Oar by oar, calculating fees. Ships in the Greek world ranged from small fishing boats to massive triremes with 170 oarsmen. Harbor fees could be calculated per vessel, per oar, or by tonnage of cargo. A trireme docking for resupply might pay a set amount per oar, a practice that ensured larger warships paid more for their greater impact on harbor resources. Merchants' ships were assessed by their cargo type. Luxury goods like purple dye or fine ceramics could incur higher rates than bulk cargoes like grain, reflecting their greater market value. Fees were sometimes adjusted seasonally. In storm-prone months, when harbors offered refuge from dangerous seas, rates might rise slightly. The bureaucracy of the sea. Like grain and olive oil taxes, harbor fees were recorded with painstaking precision. Surviving inscriptions from ports such as Delos and Rhodes detail the ship's name or identifying description, its captain, its home port, cargo type, and payment amount. A typical entry might read: from Samos, merchant vessel Dolphin, Captain Menandros, bearing 200 amphorae of wine, fee paid. 3 drachmae, received by harbor clerk Democles in the presence of priest Aristion. Such records served both as receipts and as a log for future reference. If a ship returned, the clerk could check past payments, perhaps offering favorable rates to regular traders or noting debts left unpaid. What the fees supported. The revenues from harbor dues were not insignificant. They could fund breakwater repairs, dredging of silted channels, and construction of storage warehouses. In military contexts, they might also help maintain patrol ships to keep the harbor free of pirates. In religious terms, the fees allowed for the upkeep of maritime festivals, processions, sacrifices, and games in honor of Poseidon. These events reinforced the god's association with the sea and reminded sailors and merchants alike where their safety truly lay. Harbor life and the flow of dues. Harbors were busy, noisy places. Ships arrived at all hours, guided by beacon fires at night and by landmarks in daylight. Dockworkers unloaded cargo into warehouses, merchants haggled in makeshift stalls, officials moved among the crowd, collecting dues and recording them on wax tablets. The act of paying the harbor fee was often just one step in a series of obligations: customs duties for the city, inspection of cargo for banned goods, and in some ports additional tribute for local rulers or occupying powers. The harbor fee to Poseidon was, paradoxically, the least negotiable of these. One might bribe a civic inspector, but few dared to shortchange the god of the sea. So while Poseidon's image in myth is that of a tempestuous deity, his influence in daily life could be measured in neat columns of figures, ship names, cargo lists, and drachmae amounts. Which raises an interesting question. In a world where the god's favor was both feared and taxed, did sailors think of their payment as divine protection, or just the unavoidable price of doing business? In Section 1, we saw how harbor dues tied maritime commerce to Poseidon's temples and civic treasuries. Now, let's walk further along the quay, following the scribes who tallied these fees, the captains who paid them, and the ships whose entries still echo through the stone inscriptions left behind. Arrival and declaration. When a ship approached a harbor under Poseidon's patronage, the first step after anchoring was formal declaration. The captain, or kybernetes, reported to the harbor office or the temple's appointed agent. This declaration included: home port, to establish foreign or local status; Ship type: merchant vessel, fishing boat, warship, or passenger craft. Cargo manifest, often given orally and recorded by the clerk. Crew size or oar count, particularly relevant for warships. The accuracy of these declarations was important. Harbor officials might cross-check them by inspecting the ship, counting oars, or having dockworkers verify the cargo type and quantity. Fee calculation. The calculation could be a straightforward flat rate or a more nuanced sliding scale. Ports with heavy trade like Delos or Piraeus often used more complex systems. By oar, a standard fee per oar, ensuring that larger ships contributed more to harbor maintenance. By cargo value, determined by type of goods: olive oil, wine, metals, livestock. By length of stay, short-term docking was cheaper, while long-term mooring required additional fees. Some harbors even had seasonal adjustments. Winter fees might be slightly higher, reflecting the increased need for shelter from storms and perhaps a little opportunism from the administrators. The scribe's role. Harbor scribes were the link between divine tribute and civic record. Sitting in small offices or under awnings by the docks, they recorded each transaction on wax tablets. At the end of the day, these notes were transferred to more permanent records, sometimes on papyrus, sometimes carved into stone for public reference. A surviving inscription from Delos records, line after line, ships and payments. Merchant vessel Sea Star, 40 oars from Chios, carrying amphorae of olive oil fee, 2 drachmae. Fishing boat of Naxos, 8 oars, catch of salted fish fee, 1 obol. The monotony of these lists masks their value. They reveal trade routes, commodity flows, and even the relative prosperity of different ports over time. Collection and allocation. Once fees were collected, they were divided between different recipients. The temple treasury, for religious observances, repairs, and salaries of priests. The civic treasury, for harbor maintenance, defense, and public works. Special reserves. In some cities, a portion was set aside for emergencies, like funding rescue missions for shipwrecked sailors or repairing damage from storms. How this division occurred varied. In some harbors, priests had first claim on all fees, remitting a portion to civic authorities later. In others, civic officials collected all dues and paid the temple a fixed stipend. Harbor guards and enforcement. Harbor guards ensured that no ship slipped away without paying. These men, often former sailors, patrolled the docks and could detain ships suspected of evading fees. In some cases, a ship's cargo could be impounded until payment was made. For foreign merchants, non-payment could mean being banned from the harbor in the future, a serious blow to any trader's business. For locals, it could mean public shame and religious censure, as failing to pay was seen as an insult to Poseidon himself. Economic and religious festivals. The link between fees and festivals was tangible. Annual celebrations of Poseidon, often involving boat races, sacrifices, and feasts, were partly funded by harbor dues. Inscriptions sometimes note specific payments earmarked for such events. From harbor fees, 20 drachmae allocated to the festival of the sea god, for the purchase of sacrificial bulls and musicians' wages. This meant that every captain who paid his fee was, in a sense, buying his way into the god's good graces and underwriting the spectacle that reinforced Poseidon's authority. Harbor fees as a political tool. Like oil taxes or grain ledgers, harbor dues could be adjusted for political reasons. A friendly ally might receive reduced rates or temporary exemption, recorded in both civic and temple archives. Conversely, higher fees could be imposed on merchants from rival cities, sometimes as a form of economic pressure short of outright war. One surviving decree from Rhodes specifies that ships from an unfriendly port would be charged double the customary due, with the surplus going entirely to the civic treasury rather than the temple. Such moves blurred the line between religious tribute and political maneuvering. Why the records mattered. While these entries might seem mundane, they gave harbor officials and civic leaders a real-time picture of maritime activity. If fees suddenly dropped, it might signal trouble, storms disrupting trade, piracy on the sea lanes, or political unrest deterring merchants. A surge in fees could indicate a boom, perhaps a new market opening or a rich cargo season. So while Poseidon's power in myth lay in his trident and tempests, his influence in civic life could be traced in neat, repetitive entries on a clerk's tablet. But that leaves one question dangling in the salt air. In years when storms raged and trade faltered, did the god's temple suffer along with the merchants? Or did the fear of his wrath ensure the fees kept flowing anyway? In the first two sections, we explored the mechanics of harbor fees, how they were declared, calculated, recorded, and distributed. Now, in our final look, we'll see what happened when this finely tuned system met storms, politics, and human nature, and why the survival of these boring records tells us more about the maritime world than any epic poem. When the sea closed, the Aegean and wider Mediterranean were fickle. A sudden storm season could close a harbor for weeks, drying up fee collections almost overnight. The loss wasn't just economic, it was religious. Without arriving ships, there were no offerings, no maritime dedications at Poseidon's altar. Some harbors compensated by raising rates when the seas calmed, but this was risky push fees too high, and captains might seek safer or cheaper ports. Inscriptions from Delos and Thassos record debates over this very issue, with civic assemblies weighing short-term gain against long-term reputation. Piracy and lost revenue. Piracy was a constant threat. When pirates operated freely in a region, legitimate trade dwindled, and so did the harbor fees. In some cases, fees were deliberately lowered to attract nervous merchants back to the port, coupled with public promises of better naval patrols. But pirates could also exploit the system, posing as legitimate traders, paying reduced fees, and using the harbor as a safe base before raiding elsewhere. Harbor records occasionally note suspicious ships, their ore count or cargo not matching their declared purpose, but in an age without permanent identification systems, enforcement was imperfect. The politics of exemptions. Fee exemptions, when granted for political reasons, were double-edged. They could cement alliances. A trading partner grateful for lower costs might become a staunch ally, but they also reduced income. Too many exemptions, and both the temple treasury and civic coffers suffered. A decree from the island of Tinos survives in fragmentary form, showing that ships from a certain allied city were allowed to dock, without due, for a full year. The surviving harbor fee records from the same year show a noticeable drop in overall revenue, leading some historians to suspect that not everyone in Tino assembly was happy with the generosity. Religious obligations in lean years. The temple's share of harbor fees funded offerings, sacrifices, and the upkeep of sacred spaces. Even in lean years, these rituals had to continue. The god's honor could not be neglected. This sometimes meant the civic treasury shouldered more of the harbor maintenance costs, freeing the temple to use its reduced share entirely for religious obligations. Some records explicitly note make-up offerings in later years, when revenue improved, as if paying back a spiritual debt. One such inscription reads, "For the lean year past, in which no bulls were sacrificed, 3 bulls now given, from the surplus of the harbor fee." Clerks' memory and authority. The real custodians of this system were the harbor clerks. Their careful maintenance of the ledgers ensured that disputes could be resolved, that temple priests knew what was owed, and that the civic assembly could track trends. A well-kept harbor ledger might cover years, even decades, with marginal notes about storms, political changes, or unusual cargoes. These details, so easily overlooked at the time, are now some of the richest sources for reconstructing ancient maritime history. What the records reveal today. For archaeologists and historians, harbor fee records are a treasure map of ancient trade routes. By matching inscriptions with finds of stamped amphorae or cargo remains, we can trace how wine from Chios reached Egypt, or how Athenian olive oil traveled to the Black Sea. They also tell us about the rhythm of ancient maritime life, busy seasons and quiet ones, the regular arrival of certain ships, and the sudden absence of others. This is history not of storms and heroes, but of patterns, the heartbeat of a harbor. The invisible link between myth and money. In myth, Poseidon's wrath could sink fleets. In the ledgers, his presence was measured in predictable lines of income. Sailors might swear their fee was for divine protection, but clerks knew it kept the harbor lights burning, the breakwaters sound, and the festivals funded. That dual identity, God as protector, God as revenue source, is perhaps the most telling feature of the whole system. It shows how religion, economy, and administration were intertwined, each sustaining the other in a cycle as regular as the tides. The quiet legacy. When we read these ancient fee lists now, we find no poetic flourish, no appeal to the muse, just ship Aphrodite from Miletus 30 oars carrying figs and wool, fee 2 drachmae. And yet in that one line is an entire world, a captain's livelihood, a crew's journey, a harbor's upkeep, a god's honor. So perhaps the final question for this sleepy accounting of Poseidon's harbors is this. If every oar stroke and every amphora was tallied in service of the sea god, then where did the true power lie, in the trident that ruled the waves, or in the hand of the clerk who ruled the ledger? Story 6. The calendar makers of Delphi, how oracles kept track of days. When most people think of Delphi, they imagine the Pythia, the high priestess of Apollo, perched on her tripod, uttering cryptic prophecies in the vaporous gloom of the temple. But the accuracy of those oracles depended on something far less mystical and far more methodical: the calendar. In an age without mechanical clocks or mass-printed calendars, keeping track of time was a specialized craft, and at Delphi, it was essential. Festivals, rituals, and consultations with the oracle all had to occur on precise days, often aligned with lunar or solar cycles. The priests and administrators who managed this work, the hiram mnemons and their assistants, were the quiet custodians of Delphi's rhythm. Why Delphi needed precision. Delphi wasn't just a local shrine. It was a pan-Hellenic center visited by pilgrims from across the Greek world. Cities sent embassies to consult Apollo on matters of war, colonization, and law. These visits had to be scheduled, sometimes months in advance, to coincide with the Pythia's official consultation days. If a delegation arrived on the wrong day, they might have to wait weeks for the next session, an expensive delay. Worse, an oracle delivered at the wrong time could lose its religious validity. The Delphic calendar. The Delphic calendar was a lunisolar system, meaning it followed the phases of the moon, but also had to align with the solar year to keep agricultural and festival dates consistent. Months began with the sighting of the new moon and were often named after local festivals or deities. At Delphi, the most important month was Bysios, during which the main festival of Apollo was celebrated. Other months were pegged to seasonal agricultural tasks: planting, harvesting, winemaking, ensuring that Apollo's sacred timetable matched the rhythms of life in the surrounding region. Measuring time. Timekeepers at Delphi likely used a combination of astronomical observation and established counting systems. The rising and setting of certain stars like the Pleiades marked seasonal transitions. The phases of the moon dictated the start of months, while the solstices and equinoxes helped keep the calendar in line with the solar year. The task wasn't simple. A lunar year is about 354 days long, roughly 11 days shorter than a solar year. Without adjustment, the calendar would drift out of sync with the seasons. To prevent this, the Delphic administrators occasionally inserted an extra month A practice called embolism into the year. Deciding when to do this required both astronomical knowledge and practical judgment. Recording the days. The calendar itself was recorded in multiple forms, inscribed on stone for public reference, kept on wax tablets for working notes, and preserved in temple archives for long-term records. Public inscriptions might list the dates of festivals, sacrifices, and oracle sessions for the coming year, ensuring that citizens and visitors could plan accordingly. These inscriptions, while dry, are invaluable to historians. They show not just the sequence of days, but also the hierarchy of events, which festivals took precedence, which sacrifices were to be made, and how the city structured its sacred duties. The intersection with oracles. The Pythia only spoke on specific days, traditionally one day each month, often the seventh day after the new moon, sacred to Apollo. On those days, the entire sanctuary operated according to a tight schedule: purification rituals at dawn, offerings by the petitioners, and the oracular sessions themselves. The calendar keepers had to ensure that these days were correctly identified and publicly announced. A mistake could disrupt the flow of consultations, anger petitioners, and in the eyes of the faithful, displease Apollo himself. Diplomacy and scheduling. The Delphic calendar also served as a diplomatic tool. City-states arranging to consult the oracle might coordinate their own civic calendars with Delphi's to avoid delays. Special embassies could request priority dates, which required careful rescheduling of other appointments, a task that fell squarely on the administrator's shoulders. These negotiations sometimes appear in inscriptions. On the 17th of Bysios, the people of Thebes shall receive audience before the Pythia, by decree of the Amphictyonic Council. Such entries are a reminder that even the most sacred events had a bureaucratic underpinning. So while Delphi's fame rested on the god's voice through the Pythia, that voice could only be heard in harmony with a carefully managed calendar, a system that was part astronomy, part administration, and all necessity. But it leaves us with a question. In a place where divine will was thought to guide human fate, did the keepers of the calendar ever feel that they were, in their quiet way, shaping destiny themselves? In Section 1, we saw how Delphi's calendar ensured that oracles and festivals occurred at the correct times. Now, we'll follow the actual work of the calendar makers, how they tracked time, recorded it, adjusted for discrepancies, and handled the human side of keeping the god's schedule. Watching the sky. The first duty of the calendar keepers was observation. Before the sun rose, they would be on the temple's terrace, looking east for the slim crescent of the new moon. The high position of Delphi, with its clear mountain air, made it easier to see astronomical markers, but cloud cover could delay confirmation of the new month. Star risings also played a role. The heliacal rising of Sirius, for example, was a well-known seasonal indicator across Greece. The calendar keepers would note such events alongside lunar phases, building a layered system of checks that helped them keep the months aligned with the seasons. Reconciling lunar and solar time. The real challenge was reconciling the lunar months with the solar year. 11 days short each year meant that, left unchecked, Apollo's festivals would eventually drift into the wrong season. Every 2 or 3 years, the administrators inserted an extra month, usually after a lesser festival, to realign the cycles. This wasn't done lightly. Merchants, farmers, and visiting delegations all had to adjust their schedules. The decision would be announced publicly and inscribed on stone, so no one could claim ignorance. A sample record might read, "In the archonship of Clendros, after the month of Baucasios, let there be an intercalary month of Baucasios II, by order of the Amphictyonic Council." Keeping the festival order. The Delphic year revolved around key religious events. Apollo's main festival in Bysios marked the god's birthday. The Pythian Games, one of the four great Panhellenic games, occurred every 4 years in the month of Baucasios. Lesser festivals honored Artemis, Dionysos, and other deities connected to Delphi. These events had fixed places in the year but moved in relation to the solar calendar, making the calendar makers' adjustments critical. A festival held too early might fall in bad weather, too late, and it might conflict with agricultural demands like harvest or planting. The working documents. The working version of the calendar was kept on wax tablets, updated daily with notes on weather, omens, and irregularities. These notes could influence scheduling decisions. If a festival was delayed by storms or political unrest, the adjustment had to be formally recorded so it wouldn't disrupt the next year's sequence. Temple scribes copied the final version of each year's calendar onto durable material, stone for public display, or parchment for archives. The public versions listed major festivals and oracle days, while the internal copies might include additional notes for the priest's reference. Coordinating with visitors. City-states planning to consult the oracle needed to know Delphi's calendar well in advance. Embassies often sent messengers months ahead to confirm dates, especially if they intended to compete in the Pythian Games or participate in a festival. This required careful coordination. If too many delegations requested the same consultation day, the administrators had to rearrange the order, often prioritizing allies or cities of high standing. Such decisions were political acts wrapped in the appearance of neutral scheduling. Conflict and rescheduling. Sometimes the system broke down. War, plague, or poor harvests could prevent delegations from arriving on schedule. In such cases, the administrators had to choose whether to reschedule the session or treat the appointment as forfeited. One inscription records a rare exception. The people of Argus, delayed by storm, shall receive audience on the next day following the appointed one, without loss of privilege. Such flexibility was unusual, and suggests the Argives were either highly valued allies or had influence in the Amphictyonic Council. The priestly authority. The calendar keepers, though administrators, held significant religious authority. In controlling the dates, they controlled the opportunities for divine guidance. While the Pythia spoke Apollo's will, it was the calendar that decided when his voice could be heard. This dual power, part religious, part bureaucratic, meant that the keeper's accuracy was a matter of public trust. Errors could lead to accusations of incompetence or even sacrilege. The reputation of precision. Delphi's prestige relied in part on its reputation for exact timing. Other sanctuaries might have looser festival schedules, but at Delphi, the alignment of day, ritual, and prophecy was part of the oracle's authority. If the day was wrong, the words might be doubted, a risk the administrators could not afford. So while the Delphic calendar might appear to be a dry list of days and festivals, it was in fact a living instrument of diplomacy, religion, and local governance. And that raises a lingering question. In the years when clouds hid the moon and the calculations ran thin, did the calendar keepers ever choose a date not by the sky, but by political convenience? In the first two sections, we saw how Delphi's calendar was observed, calculated, and maintained, and how it shaped the oracle's schedule. Now we'll follow the consequences of that work, the disputes, the long-term legacy, and the way the Delphic calendar influenced the broader Greek world. When dates became disputes. The authority of the Delphic calendar meant that its dates could become flashpoints for disagreement. Visiting embassies sometimes accused the administrators of favoritism, especially if their consultation was postponed in favor of another city. One surviving inscription from the late 4th century BCE records a formal complaint by the people of Phasis, claiming their designated oracle day was reassigned to the Spartans. The council's response was terse. The gods' will is not delayed by men, and those who come later must wait. Whether this was truly divine timing or a political maneuver is left to speculation, but the record shows how easily religious scheduling could become diplomatic leverage. Aligning with other Greek calendars. Each Greek city had its own calendar, with months named differently and years starting at various points in the solar cycle. This made coordination tricky, especially for Panhellenic events like the Pythian Games. The Delphic calendar often acted as a reference point. Cities attending the games or sending delegations to the oracle would compare their own festival months to Delphi, creating a patchwork of cross-references. Over time, this exchange of information helped scholars and priests identify patterns and, in rare cases, agree on standardized intercalations for major shared events. The Pythian Games as a temporal anchor. The quadrennial Pythian Games were perhaps the single most important anchor point in the Delphic calendar. They attracted athletes, poets, and musicians from across the Mediterranean, and their fixed position in the cycle meant other events could be scheduled relative to them. Because the games were tied to the seasonal grape harvest, their timing reinforced the link between agriculture, religion, and civic life. The games themselves became a form of living calendar, an event so prominent it could be used to date other happenings in the year after the Pythian Games. The role of astronomy. By the Hellenistic period, more sophisticated astronomical tools and theories began to influence calendar making. At Delphi, knowledge from visiting scholars, possibly even those influenced by Babylonian astronomy, improved the accuracy of predictions for lunar and solar events. Yet tradition still held sway. Even when astronomical calculation could predict a new moon, the official month still began only when the crescent was first sighted. The act of observation remained a ritual, blending science with religious duty. Archiving the years. The temple archives stored decades, even centuries of calendars. Stone inscriptions in public spaces might weather away, but papyrus scrolls and parchment copies in the sanctuary's storerooms preserved the long-term record. These archives were more than just administrative relics. They were historical timelines, tying political events, wars, and treaties to specific sacred dates. For later historians, they became a rare and precise chronological framework in a world where time was often reckoned loosely. When timekeeping became political, the power to control the calendar could, at moments, become outright political control. An intercalary month could be used to delay debt deadlines, extend a magistrate's term, or postpone a trial. Though we have no direct evidence of such manipulation at Delphi, the potential was there. The city's prestige and religious authority would have given its calendar decisions weight far beyond the sanctuary walls. The quiet influence beyond Delphi. The Delphic calendar's influence extended beyond Greece itself. Delegations from as far as Cyrene in North Africa and Massalia, modern Marseille in France, consulted the oracle. The process of aligning their local calendars with Delphi's may have helped transmit Greek calendrical concepts far beyond the Aegean. Some of these visitors likely brought home more than just oracular advice. They brought a way of structuring time that tied civic life to religious observance with remarkable precision. The enduring legacy. Today, the Delphic calendar survives only in fragments, inscriptions of festival lists, scattered archival notes, and references in ancient authors. But its importance is not diminished by the loss. It was the invisible infrastructure that allowed the oracle to function with authority. Without it, prophecies might have been delivered out of season, festivals held at inauspicious times, and the delicate balance of religion, politics, and agriculture disrupted. So perhaps the most enduring question is this: if Apollo was the god of truth and prophecy, and the Pythia his mouthpiece, was the calendar itself with its silent, steady marking of days the true voice that shaped the destiny of those who came to seek his counsel? Story 7. Olive oil bureaucrats of Athens how to track a jar from grove to marketplace. In the Athens of the 5th century BCE, olive oil wasn't just a kitchen staple, it was a cornerstone of the economy, a mark of cultural identity, and for many city officials, a source of endless paperwork. Athens' sun-baked hills were dotted with olive groves, some owned by wealthy aristocrats, others by small-holding farmers whose trees had been in the family for generations. But once the olives were harvested and pressed, the oil entered a world of regulation, measurement, taxation, and record-keeping that was as carefully tended as the trees themselves. The olive as civic property. Under Athenian law, olive trees had a special status. Particularly prized were the moriae, sacred olives believed to descend from the original tree planted by Athena herself. These trees were state property, no matter who owned the land they grew on, and cutting one down could lead to severe penalties, even exile. Inspectors known as epimeletai regularly toured the countryside to check the condition of these sacred trees, keeping records of their yield and ensuring they were properly cared for. Their reports formed the first link in a long bureaucratic chain. Harvest and first records. The olive harvest began in late autumn, when teams of workers knocked the fruit from the branches with poles, gathering it into baskets. From there, the olives went to local presses. The pressing itself was often supervised or at least noted by an official who recorded the amount of oil produced. Why such scrutiny? Because oil wasn't just for local consumption, it was a major export, and the state had a vested interest in tracking every amphora that left Attica's shores. The state's share. Athens collected taxes and tribute in many forms, and olive oil was no exception. Part of the bureaucracy's work was to ensure that the state received its due either in actual oil or in the revenue from its sale. Inscriptions show meticulous records of these transactions, often listing the name of the producer or landowner, the quantity of oil produced, the destination of the shipment, the taxes or fees paid. A typical entry might read, from the grove of Callias, 3 amphorae to the state store, destined for the Panathenaic prizes. Oil for the Panathenaic games. One of the largest single uses of state-controlled oil was the Panathenaic Games. Victors in certain events received large amphorae filled with the city's finest oil, often in quantities far greater than a single household could use. These amphorae were marked with the city's emblem and image of Athena and the year's archon, making them both a prize and a record of the state's generosity. The oil for these prizes had to be carefully tracked from the groves to the storage facilities, ensuring its quality and quantity met the city's standards. Storage and quality control. Oil was stored in large ceramic jars, often buried partway in the earth to keep them cool. Officials checked for spoilage, adulteration, or theft, and records were kept of each jar's condition. Quality control mattered because Athenian oil had a reputation across the Mediterranean. Merchants in Egypt, Italy, and the Black Sea ports paid premium prices for it, but only if it arrived pure and in good condition. A single shipment of spoiled oil could damage the city's reputation and cost it valuable trade relationships. The export process. When oil was approved for export, it was measured into transport amphorae and sealed. Each amphora bore marks indicating its origin, the merchant responsible, and sometimes the intended destination. These markings were cross-referenced with customs records at the port of Piraeus, where officials collected export duties and confirmed the cargo matched its paperwork. Tracking this flow of oil was a complex task that involved farmers, inspectors, scribes, tax collectors, and port officials, a chain of responsibility that began in the olive groves and ended in far-off markets. But it leads to a curious question. In a system so deeply enmeshed in rules and records, how often did a jar slip through the cracks, and was that by accident or design? In Section 1, We followed the olive oil from sacred grove to sealed amphora, seeing how the Athenian bureaucracy documented every stage. Now we'll step deeper into the machinery, the officials, the laws, and the occasional loopholes that shaped the life of an amphora of oil once it was part of the state's concern. The paperwork trail. The heart of Athens, olive oil bureaucracy was the grammateon, the official record book. Each entry was a dense block of text, listing not only the quantities of oil but also its source, ownership, and intended use. The entries followed a fixed format, often opening with the date according to the Athenian calendar month, followed by the archon's name, the district where the oil was produced, and the name of the supervising inspector. The last line recorded its destination, whether for domestic consumption, state storage, export, or special allocation. For example, month of Hecatombion, archonship of Callicrates, from the deme of Aloke, property of Aristides son of Lysimachos, overseen by Inspector Damonides 12 amphorae to state stores for distribution in the Panathenaic year. Inspectors in the field. The Epimeletai and Astynomoi were the visible face of olive oil oversight. The former handled the sacred trees, and the latter oversaw urban market regulations, including oil sales. Their field visits were as much about ensuring compliance as they were about gathering information for the central records. Field inspection was not a casual stroll. It involved measuring oil in large ceramic vessels, checking seals for tampering, and sometimes sampling for purity. Fraud could take many forms: dilution with cheaper oils, substitution with older, rancid stock, false labeling of origin, the market and price controls. Within Athens itself, the sale of olive oil was subject to regulation to prevent profiteering. Certain market inspectors, agoranomoi, had the authority to set maximum prices for basic goods, including oil. This created a dual system. Oil for the export trade could command high prices abroad, while oil sold locally had to remain affordable enough for citizens to buy. The balance was delicate. Too much focus on export profits, and the local market might resent shortages or high prices. Oil as a political tool. Because the state controlled significant oil reserves, politicians sometimes used distributions as a way to gain public favor. During times of shortage, free or discounted oil could be given to citizens, a move remembered in public inscriptions as a gesture of civic generosity. These handouts, though rare, were carefully recorded. In the archonship of Nicomacho, in the month of Bodromion, the assembly decreed that each citizen shall receive 1 cottle of oil from the state stores, in thanks for the defense of the city walls. The port of Piraeus, the gateway. Once destined for export, an amphora's final Athenian stop was the bustling port of Piraeus. Here, customs officials compared physical cargo to the paperwork, collecting duties and stamping amphorae with official seals to indicate cleared export. This was a bottleneck point and therefore a point where smuggling could occur. Inspectors had to balance efficiency with vigilance, as delays could anger merchants and harm trade relations. The smuggling problem. Despite layers of oversight, oil smuggling was a known issue. One method involved falsifying amphora marks to claim the oil was from a lower taxed region, or using old amphorae with outdated seals to disguise untaxed shipments. Punishments for smuggling varied, but could include confiscation of the cargo, heavy fines, or, in extreme cases, loss of trading rights in Athens. These punishments were inscribed in public places as both deterrent and spectacle. Diplomatic oil. Not all oil left Athens for profit. Diplomatic gifts, often large quantities of fine oil, were sent to allied cities or foreign dignitaries. These shipments bypassed normal taxation, but were documented in even greater detail, both for accountability and as a record of the city's generosity. Such gifts had symbolic value. To receive Athenian olive oil was to receive a piece of the city's identity, tied to its goddess and its land. An administrative balancing act. Managing the oil trade was an exercise in balancing sacred tradition, economic reality, and political expediency. Too much regulation risked slowing trade and alienating merchants. Too little risked loss of revenue and the sanctity of sacred olive groves. It's here that the bureaucracy's role as both gatekeeper and facilitator becomes clear. The same official who inspected a grove for sacred trees might also sign off on an export destined for a distant colony 2 acts, worlds apart, tied together by an unbroken chain of record-keeping. But this precision brings up a lingering question. If Athens' olive oil system was so meticulous, why do a handful of surviving records hint at entire shipments vanishing from the books? Was it clerical error or deliberate erasure? The missing shipments mentioned at the end of Section 2 invite a closer look at the vulnerabilities in Athens' olive oil bureaucracy. In this final section, we'll explore how records could vanish, what those losses meant for the city, and how the oil trade's legacy endured long after the amphorae themselves had disappeared into foreign markets, where the trail went cold. In theory, an amphora of oil could be tracked from its first pressing to its final sale. In practice, the documentation often frayed at the edges. Shipwrecks were one obvious cause of lost records. If a vessel sank, the paperwork might never be updated, leaving an unfinished line in the grammateon. But there were subtler causes. An inspector might neglect to file a report. A merchant could deliberately misplace documentation to avoid taxes. Political upheavals, such as the oligarchic coups of 411 BCE and 404 BCE, sometimes led to deliberate destruction of civic records. The role of middlemen. The Athenian oil trade depended on middlemen brokers who bought oil from multiple producers and consolidated it into large export shipments. This aggregation complicated record-keeping, because an amphora might pass through several hands before reaching Piraeus. In cases where middlemen had strong political connections, missing paperwork might be quietly overlooked, especially if the oil's ultimate destination served strategic alliances. Oil and the Navy. Athens' maritime empire relied on its navy, and oil played a role there too. Rowers needed food and supplies, and olive oil, a source of calories and a preservative for rations, was part of naval provisioning. Large-scale withdrawals from state stores for naval campaigns were recorded, but not always in full detail, especially during wartime when urgency overrode bureaucracy. Naval requisitions could blur the lines between military necessity and economic policy. A shipment ostensibly bound for a friendly port might in fact be supplying a fleet on campaign. The archaeological evidence. Modern archaeology has added another layer to our understanding of Athens' oil trade. Shipwrecks discovered in the Mediterranean often contain amphorae marked with Athenian stamps, their shapes and inscriptions matching those listed in ancient inventories. These finds confirm the wide reach of the oil trade. Athenian amphorae have been found in Egypt, the Levant, Italy, and as far west as Spain. They also reveal patterns in trade routes and seasonal shipping, offering clues to how the bureaucracy's scheduling matched the rhythms of the sea. A system of trust and reputation. Despite its complexities and occasional corruption, the Athenian oil trade worked because it was built on mutual trust between farmers and inspectors, merchants and officials, Athens and its trading partners. Quality and reliability were the city's brand. To damage that brand was to jeopardize not just individual profits but the reputation of Athens itself. This awareness underpinned the meticulousness of the bureaucracy, even when it sometimes failed to catch every missing jar. Oil as cultural export. More than a commodity, Athenian olive oil carried cultural significance. The amphorae themselves, decorated with images of Athena or scenes from athletics, were as much advertisements for the city as they were containers. In foreign markets, these amphorae became prized possessions, sometimes repurposed for storage long after the oil was gone. In this way, Athens exported its identity along with its goods. The decline of the system. The Peloponnesian War and its aftermath strained the olive oil bureaucracy. With the loss of overseas territories and disruptions in trade, the careful balance of production, taxation, and export began to falter. By the 4th century BCE, while the trade remained important, Athens no longer held the same commanding position in Mediterranean oil markets. Competing producers from other Greek regions and abroad began to erode its dominance. The lasting record. Even as Athens' economic power waned, the detailed records of its olive oil trade lived on in inscriptions and accounts preserved by later historians. These documents offer a window into the quiet machinery that underpinned one of the ancient world's most valuable exports. What's remarkable is not just the scale of the trade, but the bureaucratic sophistication required to manage it, a system that, in its precision, rivaled the administration of modern commodities. In the end, one is left with an oddly human image, a scribe in a shaded corner of the agora, scratching lines into a wax tablet about the journey of a jar of oil, a journey that, for all its careful tracking, might vanish into the anonymity of distant ports. Was that disappearance a failure of the system, or simply the price of doing business in a world where the sea always kept some secrets?